Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bob Kane, and I am the Market President at KeyBank. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for tonight's webinar. From Belarus to Lebanon to Venezuela, democracy on the table around the world, which is the final installment of a three-part series exploring the threats, opportunities, limits, and future of democracy at home and around the world. For tonight's webinar, our panelists will discuss country and regional hotspots facing executive corruption, the erosion of individuals' rights, rising populism, and other challenges facing global governance and democracy. For many years, KeyBank has proudly supported the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and their work creating a space for civil discourse about these important topics and more, and their mission of providing critical educational resources to our region's students so that our next generation of leaders are equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary in our global economy. I'm now going to turn it over to Lauren Schwartz, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, who will further introduce tonight's panelists. Thank you. Lauren?
Thank you, Bob. I certainly want to extend my personal thank you, and on behalf of our council and our members, our gratitude towards KeyBank for being our corporate sponsor of the event series. We are deeply appreciative of your long commitment to the Council's mission of bringing global education and civil discourse to Philadelphians of all ages and of all backgrounds. I'd also like to thank the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University for serving as our education sponsor. We're always grateful to work with you and to welcome your faculty, staff, and students to these events, even in these virtual times. And I'm delighted to welcome members of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and other guests from around the region and the country. We're bringing you fresh, nonpartisan civil discourse on critical issues affecting the world. We have been and will continue to play a key role in international affairs education for all ages by creating respectful and deep discussions. We'll continue to ask the right questions about the world around us, all from our home here in Philly. I would like to offer a special welcome to some of the high school students, college students, and teachers who participate in the Council's education programs throughout the year. We work with over 2,500 youth each year to provide foreign affairs education across the region. And as we know, these students are not just the leaders of our future, but they're solving problems today. Now, if you have any technical issues during the program or you'd like to send questions for our panelists, please use the questions bar, and the Council's Vice President of Programs, Haley Boyle, will help you behind the scenes. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible, so please keep them coming. And now I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's panelists. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Frances Brown, the Senior Fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she works in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Dr. Brown previously worked at the White House, USAID, and has written extensively on conflict, governance, and US foreign policy. And we welcome Dr. John Mukumbako, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute and their Global Economy and Development, Africa Growth Initiative, and the Brady Presidential Distinguished Professor of Economics at Weber State University. And we also welcome Ms. Sarah Rapucci, Vice President of Research and Analysis at Freedom House. Ms. Rapucci has more than 10 years of experience in research and evaluation techniques in the areas of democracy, human rights, and good governance. Tonight's program concludes our three-part series called Democracy on the Table, which launched the night before the US presidential election. Of course, we focused on Western Europe and in the US in the first installment, on Russia and China in the second. And tonight we will broaden the scope in this third and final installment to take a look at more threats to democracy all over the world. We'll start with some brief opening remarks from each of our panelists, followed by moderated discussion, and then the audience Q&A. Sarah, could we start with you for opening remarks, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I'm going to just speak a bit about global elections. And, we've had a lot of really important elections this year, some here at home and many abroad, including even just this week. And I think, when COVID-19 first started, there was a question of whether elections could go forward in a situation of a pandemic where people weren't supposed to gather in groups. And there was a fear that postponing elections was going to postpone democracy. I think what has happened over the last 9 months is that some elections have been postponed and have caused really unprecedented situations. A really important example there is Ethiopia, which has been improving in its democratic indicators over the past couple of years, but then it postponed its election that was supposed to be held in August due to COVID-19. And now, of course, there is open conflict there, and the opportunity for holding elections seems to have passed. So that opportunity for consolidating the national vote and bringing people together may be gone. But ultimately, I think it's interesting to note that very few countries have actually postponed their elections for so long that it jeopardized the government's mandate. By Freedom House's count, among the 24 countries that were meant to hold a national election between January and August of this year, 22 of those 24 actually held the vote. And there were also governments that pushed ahead with scheduled elections to the detriment of election integrity and public trust. So, postponement can be a problem, but you can also see the situation where the election being held could be a problem as well. I think a really good example there would be Poland, which scrambled to hold a presidential election in May and failed to make the necessary technical preparations. And then they postponed the election only 4 days before it was meant to be held until the end of June, and then they still weren't well prepared. And the confusion and the maneuvering around that left many people wondering about political motivations. And of course, the ruling party did win that election. So I think the bottom line is that when you introduce politicization into an election process, whether that's real politicization or whether it's just perceived among the population, it can be really toxic for public trust, and that can take a really long time to recover. And I think we're even seeing something similar in the US right now. So I think that the tail of COVID-19, even when we all have the vaccine and things go back to normal again, I think the impact of what has happened over the course of this year and into next year is going to be very long. I will point out one positive thing before I close my remarks that has come out of COVID for elections. The pandemic has forced people to reconsider what participation looks like. And there have been, in some cases, really massive expansion of voting options. And I think that those lessons can be carried forward after the pandemic as well. It's really valuable to learn how to hold good elections during a crisis, whether that's a health pandemic or a natural disaster or any other kind of crisis. We never know when the next one is going to hit. And democracy can't be put on hold every time there's a bump in the road. So I think, overall, the lessons that we've had from this year are, some warning signs and some areas of concern, but also a lot of opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. John, opening remarks, please.
Thank you. I'm very happy to participate in this very important program. I want to thank the World Affairs group for inviting me to participate. With respect to Africa, the pandemic did force some countries to postpone elections, but several countries did go ahead with elections. Now, what happened in many of these countries that went ahead with the elections was that turnout was relatively poor, primarily because many people did not understand exactly what was going on with respect to COVID, because many of the countries were unable to provide adequate information to their citizens for a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons political. For example, in Egypt, the government was actually very critical of newspapers that were trying to publish data on infection rates, number of people who were being infected. And in some other countries, governments did not have the capacity to provide information to their citizens, primarily because of language problems. If you consider the fact that in many countries in Africa, most of the people in the country, like Cameroon, for example, which has English and French as its official languages, many citizens don't speak either of those languages. And so it's very difficult for the government to provide information to people. And another problem has to do with the fact that in many countries in Africa, people don't trust their governments. So when the government was trying to inform people about COVID, many of them did not really take the information seriously, and so on. So in those countries where there were elections like Guinea, Cameroon, Mali, Benin Republic, Burundi, turnout was very poor. And part of the problem, or part of the things that we need to consider very seriously, is that in many of these countries, governing political parties are often associated with specific ethnic groups or specific subcultures. For example, in Cameroon, the ruling party is dominated by Francophones, and the Anglophones have been cut out of power. But in addition to that, the president is also associated with a specific ethnic group. And so what has happened is that if you postpone elections, those groups that are not in power, the ethnic groups or the subcultures that are not part of the ruling coalition, they usually see that as an attempt by the government to continue to marginalize them. So even if there is a very good reason for why it is necessary to postpone elections and wait until such a time that it's appropriate to hold elections, many subcultures within the African countries that are not currently participating in government would see that postponement as an attempt by the ruling coalition to continue to marginalize them. So it's very important for governments to consider very seriously why it is important for them not to postpone elections, but for them to find out a way to make sure that they hold the elections. But COVID is something that many African countries did not anticipate and do not have the facilities to deal with it. And so it's been very difficult for them to hold elections. I was talking to an elections official from Togo, and he was telling me that even if the government wanted to, it didn't have enough resources to provide all the necessary equipment like masks, cleaning materials, and so on, and so that would keep people safe when they participated in elections. So many of the elections, virtually all of the elections that were held in these countries were face-to-face elections. Many of these countries, except perhaps for South Africa and maybe Kenya and a few other countries, do not have the capability to hold elections online. So one of the lessons that African countries are learning from this particular pandemic is that they need to provide the necessary infrastructure to improve the ability of their citizens to have access to the internet, because even after COVID is no longer a threat, it is going to be very important for purposes of inclusion and participation for these countries to have better access to technology.
Thank you, John. Frances, opening remarks?
Great, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And as someone who has family ties to Philadelphia, it's particularly nice for me. So I think my co-panelists really showed very well how it is a mixed picture for global democracy right now, and specifically on elections as well. I like the way Sarah put it, that there are warning signs, but there are also opportunities. And I think John gave us a really good description, particularly in Africa, some of those dynamics. What I wanted to do very briefly was provide a sense of how our new US administration might approach these challenges of democracy. President-elect Biden has made democracy and restoring democracy, both at home and abroad, one of his major pillars that he talks about. And we also hear his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, talk about this a lot as well. So while I don't have all the answers for exactly how they'll address it, and a lot will depend on other key appointments, I think we can see some contours of how the new US administration might tackle these challenges. So the first element of this is that Biden has pledged to hold a democracy summit. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Biden has pledged to hold a democracy summit within his first year in office. I think this would be a big sign to the world. I also, as a former White House staffer, I think it'll be a big headache for those who are planning it, but I think it's going to be a really important and exciting event. This summit, he said, will focus on a few themes: fighting corruption globally, defending against authoritarianism, and advancing human rights both at home and abroad. I think it'll invite a wide array of participants, both other governments and then also civil society and NGOs and the private sector. So this will be a big step. Biden has also said he's going to recommit to democratic alliances. The current president has spent a lot of time picking fights, particularly with leaders of our democratic allied countries. And I think we're going to see a shift in tone from the new administration, especially when it comes to European allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada. These are all our longstanding democratic allies. And I think in general, we'll see from the Biden administration much more emphasis on diplomatic ties, bilateral ties, and multilateral ties. Speaking of multilateral ties, I think we'll see the US be much more active on democracy and human rights issues in fora like the United Nations. There's a UN Human Rights Council that we've withdrawn from under the current administration. I suspect we will rejoin that and look at other fora for that. I do think there'll be a greater focus on civil society in general. Oftentimes, democracy isn't just about working with the leaders of a country, it's also civil society and freedom of association. So I think we'll see much more focus on that. I do think we're going to, John talked about some of the challenges in Africa, and a challenge both in Africa and in many countries around the world is what to do about leaders who exceed their term limits or postpone elections, as both of my co-panelists discussed. And I do think there's just going to be a lot more scrutiny from the Biden administration on the many kind of subtle ways that leaders sort of make anti-democratic moves without doing an overt coup. I think one of the reasons we'll see more scrutiny is just that the State Department under the current administration has really been hollowed out. A lot of the senior level and mid-level career staff have departed. And I think we're going to see in the Biden administration a focus on bringing back that strength. So you'll just have simply more people in embassies watching these issues and I think speaking out when democratic norms are violated. Another theme, I think we're going to see much more support for democracy and election programming run by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, as well as the State Department. The Trump administration has not been very supportive of foreign assistance like this. I think the Biden administration will reverse that. Next, I think we're going to see a lot of prioritization on anti-corruption in specific. This is something that I think matters both domestically and in terms of the U.S. foreign relations. The president-elect has spoken about this. There's a few acts that he can utilize or can maybe expand on those initiatives as well. So I think this is a big deal. And then finally, I think we're going to see a greater focus on rights of marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community overseas and at home as well. The current administration has spoken up on some human rights issues, but it's been pretty selective. They've focused a lot on international religious freedom, which is an important human right, but they haven't necessarily been as vocal on other human rights issues. So I think we're going to see a broader embrace of the human rights agenda. And then the final thing I'll just say before I stop is that the new administration has made it clear that they view restoring democracy as something that needs to happen both overseas and at home here in the United States. And I think I don't need to tell viewers here from Pennsylvania that our own democratic systems have been under strain as well. So I think there'll be a focus on our own reforms that we can make here, which I think is productive. That said, of course, there's limits to what the president or the executive branch can do in terms of reforming our own democratic systems. Obviously, Congress has a huge role to play here. The judiciary has a huge role to play here. But I do think there's going to be a sense that we, the United States, need to hold for ourselves the same high standards that we hold others when it comes to global democracy. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Francis. There's so much to talk about. I have 10 more questions for you, but we'll get to audience questions before I add to my pile. Sarah, I want to go back to you and circle back, and we'll touch on elections and COVID for a minute more. You all touched on how elections were under threat, and sometimes postponing them or going forward with them caused problems of different types and sizes. Although when we look at the American election, which was challenging to implement and now has been heavily challenged by the incumbent, all of the reports coming out say it was actually one of the safest, most transparent and clear and participated elections in recent history. So I'd like to ask you to comment on that. Is that true based on all the research you've done? And are there examples in other countries where that also happened, where postponing an election or going ahead with it at the same time actually increased participation, transparency, and accuracy in a positive way? We can't hear you.
Oh, all right.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. I agree that this election, I mean, of course, we had more people turn out than in any previous US election. Turnout was really high despite all of the challenges, both challenges for individuals who wanted to go to vote and challenges on the administration side, all of the precautions that they had to take into account and all of the preparations that had to be done. And yet we were able to pull this off, and I think that's a huge feat for democracy. We're the most probably visible democracy in the world, in some ways, you know, way up there with the most influential. And the fact that we were able to go through with this vote is really important, both for us and for the world. I think that there are some other examples. South Korea was the first country to hold a nationwide election once the pandemic had started. And they also had higher turnout than they've had since 1992. And it was, in that case, really an overwhelming landslide in support of the ruling party. I think people had really great trust in what the government was doing at that time. I think we all can remember those early days when there was so much uncertainty and we didn't know how the virus spread, and we didn't know what was safe and what wasn't. And the South Korean bureaucracy was able to benefit from their past experience with SARS and with swine flu, and to put measures into place that really instilled trust in the population and allowed people to go out and vote. Another really positive case was in New Zealand, where the election was scheduled for September, and that was a long-running date. And the government started preparing in May for what they were going to have to do in order to have the proper protective equipment, have alternative options for people who were either quarantining or sick and couldn't go vote in person, have the right measures at the polling places, whether that's masks and distancing, having enough space. So there are definitely countries that did really pull through. It is definitely concerning how much doubt has been sown around the result of our election here, and I think that the accusations that so far have not been proven that there has been any fraud in this election has undermined trust in a way that really has nothing to do with COVID-19, but is deeply problematic for our democracy. And I think that the fallout here, I think, will end up being much more about that than about COVID-19.
Thanks, Sarah. And I want to build on that and move over to Francis. We know COVID-19 has had this dramatic effect on, frankly, everything, right? And we've touched on elections, but how else do you see that coronavirus has affected or exacerbated other pillars of democratic governance around the world? Are there examples of non-election challenges to democracy that have arisen out of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think we've seen this in a few domains. And of course, it's hard to generalize because COVID's effects on democratic governance around the world, of course, has been mixed depending on the country. But just to pull out a few themes very broadly, I think we've seen a trend of abridgment of fundamental rights in many places. We've seen expanded state surveillance, and we've seen the centralization of state power in many places. So I will expand. And then we've also seen the fourth one, I would say, is pressure on socio-political cohesion. So increased polarization, basically. So a few words on all of those. On abridgment of fundamental rights, we've seen in particular restrictions on the media or pressure on free press coming out as a result of the pandemic. We've seen governments take advantage of the pandemic as a pretext to put pressure on the media. When you add this to high levels of disinformation we've seen over the course of the pandemic, I would say that in general, this adds up to a pretty challenging environment for free and independent media, which is something I think we'll have to grapple with long after the pandemic is over. The other basic rights that we've seen affected quite seriously are the rights to privacy and the rights to assembly, so protest, association. We have seen unprecedented levels of citizen surveillance and a lot of crackdowns on protests that are being taken in the name of public health, but also in many cases, these crackdowns have not actually been circumscribed by law. They've been beyond what was probably reasonable for either law or health reasons. The next broad theme that I just touched upon as well is surveillance. The pandemic has provided a pretext for surveillance of many citizens well beyond, again, what might be needed for a health reason. We've even seen states like Norway, very deeply democratic states, flirt with the idea of public health surveillance. Citizens there mobilized to stop the actual use of this high-tech surveillance, but it just shows you that in the pandemic, these ideas can come to the fore. And then we've also seen in other democracies like India and South Korea, a lot more high-tech surveillance that's become the norm. The third trend I would point to is centralizing powers, is state or leaders using the pandemic as a way to expand their power or centralize their power. So a few examples of this. We've seen a lot of emergency pandemic-related legislation that in some countries was either overbroad or went unchecked. Maybe it didn't have a sunset time, so it was sort of an open-ended state of emergency. This is all added up to a significantly enlarged role for national governments in many places. Hungary is one key example of this, but we've also seen it in countries ranging from the Philippines to South Korea to the UK. So it's a trend that's pretty widespread. Another element of that is increased state control over the information environment, which has posed a challenge for civil society. So we've seen internet shutdowns, crackdowns on social media, restrictions on the press that I mentioned before. We've seen this especially in countries like Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, Nigeria, and Tanzania. That said, there's a flip side, which is that civil society has adapted in many of these places. So they've used various strategies to circumvent restrictions, like VPN. So it kind of goes both ways. And then finally, we've seen a lot of pressure on socio-political cohesion in many countries, which also has really important impacts on democracy. So increased polarization. I think in many places, the pandemic has brought to the fore a fear of the other, or entrenched dynamics of populism, polarization. There's especially been a lot of citizen demands on governments for better economic relief, better management of the pandemic, better public health, and this has come to the fore. As these grievances have mounted and states have oftentimes not actually responded very effectively, I would say that socio-political cohesion has been really strained. And again, I think we're going to be seeing the wake of this, this trend for a really long time to come. I'll leave it there for now.
Indeed, we will. John, you published a piece on the threats to democracy in Africa at the end of October. And I think that most folks have heard quite a bit in the headlines last year about places like Hong Kong and Belarus, and most recently Ethiopia and a few other places you mentioned in your opening remarks. While Ethiopia is making the news and the headlines more than other places, it's just one example on the entire African continent. As you wrote in your article, there have been constitutional changes in several other countries like Togo, Cameroon, and Egypt. What do you think can be done about the weakening of democratic institutions throughout Africa?
Thank you. I think that when you look at Africa as a whole, one of the things you see is that since the early 1990s, there have been tremendous changes in institutions in Africa. So many countries in the continent have actually either amended their constitutions or come up with new constitutions that have separation of power, and have provided I think there's an echo. I don't know where the echo is coming from. But what we've seen is that many countries in Africa have introduced new constitutions or amended their constitutions. And those processes have introduced two important things that are supposed to advance democracy or help these countries entrench democracy. The first one is term limits for presidents. The idea was that by introducing term limits, it would make it much more difficult for people to stay in power indefinitely. The second one was to introduce a separation of powers so that you have three branches of government like you have in the US. The unfortunate thing there is that although this new constitution did provide an opportunity for these countries to entrench democracy by providing citizens with a way to make sure that one individual did not dominate government indefinitely. Unfortunately, elections, which became very important for democracy in Africa, have been abused by many countries, by many presidents. For example, in Cameroon, the presidents have been using these elections to actually promote non-democratic governing systems. So one of the things that we need to do is to understand that elections alone will not make a democracy. In addition to elections, you also have to provide citizens with other rights. For example, civil liberties, political rights, freedom of expression and assembly, freedom to form political parties and participate in government. So unless you have a system in which you actually have real competitive political parties, you are not going to be able to entrench democracy in these countries. The second issue that we need to keep in mind is that many countries, and there are several of them, I can name just a few: Togo, Uganda, Chad, Cameroon, Rwanda, Egypt. In these countries, the presidents have been able to take advantage of relatively weak legislatures, weak parliaments, to change the constitution and eliminate the two-term limit for presidents. After the coup was conducted, after the coup that overthrew the democratically elected president of Egypt, El-Sisi eventually became president, and shortly after he became president, he immediately went into work and had the constitution changed so that he is likely to stay in power until, I believe, 2030 or beyond. And you have the same thing in Togo. The same thing in Cameroon. The president of Cameroon has been in power since 1982. He was supposed to leave power in 2011, but in preparation for that, he had the constitution changed in 2008 to allow him to remain in power indefinitely. So many people in Cameroon now believe that he will die in power. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that even if you have separation of powers with what are supposed to be checks and balances, the problem in many countries in Africa is that those checks and balances are very weak. You don't have an independent judiciary, a judiciary that can challenge the president, or a judiciary in which if opposition parties go to court to challenge an election, the judiciary would actually do the job that it's supposed to do, as it did in Kenya and in Ghana. But if you have a weak judiciary, or a judiciary that's under the control of the president, then the president can stay in power indefinitely, even if he doesn't win an election, because the judiciary would rule in his favor. So we in Africa, we need to make sure that with the separation of powers, which many Africans have, that process functions, because in many countries it really doesn't function. And the third thing that I need to talk about is government impunity. If you look at what happened in Nigeria recently, is that Nigeria was exposed as a country in which police officers kill people at will and get away with it. This has been going on in Nigeria for a very long time, even though Nigeria claims to be a democratic country. And you see the same problem in many other countries, even in Kenya. Extrajudicial killings are not unusual in Kenya. So government impunity is very important. So if we are going to have democracy in Africa, we have to have a system in which the rule of law, and what we mean by that is that no one in the country, even including the president or anybody else, is above the law. So anyone who commits a crime must be brought to justice. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to entrench democracy the way it should be. And finally, there are other things, but these are the most important one. The next thing is corruption. Corruption is a very, very big problem in Africa. And one of the things you have to consider about corruption in Africa is that corruption in the US, for example, or in Europe, when a public official is engaged in corruption, people usually look at that official as being corrupt, and that is the end of the story, that official. But you see, because of the way politics are in Africa, when a public servant is corrupt, like the president, people do not look at that corruption as just being the president. They look at that corruption as implicating members of the president's subculture or ethnic group. And so other ethnic groups don't see the corruption as saying, hey, this president is corrupt, and so it's a bad thing. When they look at the corruption, they say, wait a minute, this president and his or her ethnic group are the ones who are eating public funds. And why are we not able to do so? So instead of fighting for corruption to be eliminated, most of the people in the ethnic groups that are not associated with the president are simply not interested in improving governance to eliminate corruption. All they're interested in is saying, when are we going to have our turn to be able to capture the presidency and be in a position to do the same thing that the incumbent president is doing. And so that way of thinking becomes becomes a major constraint to the entrenchment of democracy in itself. Thank you. I can't hear you.
This is the hardest part of every day, is muting and unmuting. Am I good? Yeah, okay. A lot to talk about in Africa, and it's almost unfair to say, tell us about Africa, and then give you just a few minutes, but thanks for packaging that for us, John. I want to move to some sort of quick rapid fire answers among the three of you. One is on the topic of protests. John just gave us a sense of all the things that are sort of pushing and pulling in communities and government. And we've seen rises of protests happening all over the world in places we think of it as being familiar or having gone quiet for a while, like in our own country, in places where we never expected it to happen. Can you just quickly each share a little bit about your thoughts on how successful have these protests been? And what is different about the protest movements we're seeing now around the world than protests of the past? Sarah, let's start with you quickly.
Quickly, I would say they haven't been especially successful. I mean, especially where there's kind of a David and Goliath, Hong Kong against China, the Belarusian population against an entrenched dictator. You know, we've seen major pushback. We've seen sometimes in the case of Hong Kong and China, it kind of went quiet for a while, and then China came through with the national security law and really clamped down. So I think, unfortunately, the mass movement of protest, it's a really positive sign of people's desire for accountability and for better governance. But it has yet to bring about sustained change in most cases. In terms of whether it's different, I mean, I think it's different because the world is different in a lot of ways, not just COVID, but the internet and what that does, and the way that allows people to organize, the grievances that they have are different. But at the same time, I do think that there's huge similarities between, say what happened in 1989 or in 1968. People, again, they want their lives to be better, and they want their government to help with that. And it's, I would say that it's just a return to those same desires and a feeling among the population that traditional mechanisms like elections are not bringing results, so they have to go to those streets.
Indeed. Frances, what are your thoughts?
Just to quickly add on, I agree with everything Sarah said. I would just add that 2019 was really a banner year for protests. And then when the pandemic began, it obviously gave a pretext for many leaders to crack down. But that actually in recent months, we've actually seen a resurgence of protests to a huge degree. In November, by one document, every 3 days, we had a new anti-government protest emerge. So it's a high level. Just one thing to note on what else is different about this current round of protests versus previous ones. Most of today's protest movements are really leaderless. And a lot of that has to do with, as Sarah mentioned, the way that technology allows protests to be organized. But whereas previously you would either see, one leader or a civil society organization kind of be the core of a big protest, a lot of the current protest generation are much more diffuse, kind of coalitions brought together, huge big tent events. One outgrowth of that is that it makes these protest movements, it makes it harder for them to put together a sort of defined agenda. What are they, what would they like to see come out of the protest other than sort of better governance or addressing grievances? But when it comes to specific demands, it's very hard to have those come out of a leaderless protest. So I think that's a challenge we're seeing many of these protests face. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Frances. John, your thoughts on protests and their effectiveness and differences from the past?
Well, I think one of the things that we see in protests in Africa is that many of them are led by young people who are very familiar with the new technologies. And what that has done is that it has allowed them to cross boundaries that previously were never crossed before. And that has to do with the fact that in previous years, many protests always had an ethnic dimension. But as we saw in Nigeria recently, what has happened is that young people are beginning to see that government oppression usually is not limited to specific ethnic groups as it used to be. And so many young people are now getting together over several platforms like Zoom, for example, and engaging in WhatsApp, and engaging in protests that cut across religious and ethnic dimensions. And the second aspect is that many Africans who are living abroad, Africans in the diaspora, are actually participating and providing leadership for this protest. In Cameroon, for example, where the Anglophones are protesting marginalization by the Francophone-dominated government, the protest has been helped significantly by Cameroonians, both Francophone and Anglophone, who live in the diaspora and who believe that what is happening in the country is actually destroying the country's democratic system. And so one of the things that we are beginning to see emerge from the new protest is that it's providing many young people with an opportunity to see that democracy is good for the country as a whole, and that allowing the government to continue to oppress people, even if those people that are being oppressed are not members of their group, is bad for the entire country as a whole. Now, there's one thing that I wanted to mention, but which I didn't, and that is the fact that COVID has actually allowed many people in Africa to see the extent to which their governments have failed to provide certain services for them. For example, adequate clean water. Because when COVID came and many people were instructed to wash their hands, in several areas, especially in urban areas, it was very difficult for people to find the clean water to wash their hands. So many people are beginning to realize how dysfunctional their governments are. And of course, when we talk about inadequate healthcare systems, many African countries do not have adequate healthcare systems, and COVID has actually made a lot of people aware of that. And the final thing here is that COVID has made many governments in Africa realize the importance of communication, the importance of finding a way to communicate with everybody in the country, so that when there's an emergency, it will be possible for the government to transmit information quickly and effectively to the rest of the population. So those are some of the things that COVID has allowed people in Africa to begin to realize. And I hope that by doing so, they can work on those things and be able to entrench democracy and provide people with the institutions to participate in both government and the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's the hope of many, right? The very tired phrase of "don't waste a crisis now" applies in so many opportunities and asks of citizens to their governments. We're going to switch to audience questions now. We've got quite a few coming in. This one's about American politics, so I'm going to go to Francis with this one. As somebody who's worked in the White House, the question from our audience reads, is there a way to help Republicans understand that the election was free and fair here in the US?
So I think this is a really important question, and I think I appreciate the question. I think that the most important message can probably be sent by Republicans who have the trust of their constituency. So I think we've seen some Republican lawmakers, a very small number, but some, stand up and say, you know, all of the evidence shows this was a free, fair, secure election, historically so. I also think personally it was very effective to see kind of mid-ranking technocrats like secretaries of states or, you know, electoral commission officials of specific states go on television and explain what they were doing and what they had done. I think hearing it from the horse's mouth is effective. But then finally, I do think misinformation and disinformation is pretty hard to counteract, and we're seeing that kind of case in point right now. I switched to Fox News last night just to sort of see what the messages were coming out, and it is a sort of parallel reality. So it is really hard to counteract, and other than kind of firsthand narratives, I think I don't have another suggestion, unfortunately.
Thank you. Sarah, we've got a question that I'll direct at you. It says, what is happening now in Hong Kong? It feels like it was such a hot issue at the beginning of the year, and I haven't heard much about it lately. What are the issues? Where do we stand in Hong Kong?
Yeah, so, you know, of course, all last year was one of the longest standing protests ever, and it continued into this year. I think COVID dampened it a bit, but I think the biggest thing that dampened it was the national security law that China passed specifically for Hong Kong in June. That law makes it the case where anyone who is advocating for democracy or a position that is counter to China, that it's a criminal offense. And we have seen some arrests under that law. We've seen some very prominent democracy activists who have been arrested. And I think that the outpouring of global support for Hong Kong last year has really been cowed by the unfortunate fact that many countries, business companies, many people feel that China's too powerful for them to criticize. And so unfortunately, the Hong Kong people have really been left in many ways without support and up against the power of the Chinese Communist Party. They're unfortunately really struggling to maintain their fight for democracy. And I think that you know, in retrospect, when we look back at 2020, it's pretty likely that we will say that this was really the end of democracy in Hong Kong.
Heavy statement. Unfortunately, I think you're right. We've got a couple more audience questions I want to try and squeeze in here. John, we'll go to you next. This question says that as American democracy has been on stage tremendously so this year, it's also been on stage in a lot of negative lights, right? A lot of questioning about the strength of our democracy coming from within and people observing. And as other fledgling democracies around the world used to always look to the United States as the leader, as the role model on how to build their democracies. Have other countries emerged outside of the United States that are now taking a leadership role as an icon of democracy and a best model to follow?
Well, with respect to Africa, there are a few countries that are emerging in Africa that are doing very well when it comes to maintaining democratic systems. South Africa, for example, has gone through a lot of turmoil, and the ruling party there has been criticized a lot. But one of the things that we have to be very careful when we look at a country and democracy is we have to look a lot more on the institutions than on the individuals. Because even if individuals in power misbehave, for example, like the former president of South Africa was criticized a lot because he actually got in a lot of trouble and did a lot of things that were anti-democratic. But the important thing there is that in the end, the system, the institutions that were established by the 1996 Constitution, the post-apartheid Constitution, worked very well to restore the system. And so even though South Africa has a lot of problems, especially dealing with inequality and extreme poverty, they have a very good judicial system. And I've been reading a lot of rulings from the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And one of the things you see there, especially with respect to individual rights, rights for women, for example, rights for LGBT people, rights for indigenous groups, the rulings coming out of that court are really good. And what has happened is that in several instances, for example, when the government of South Africa decided unilaterally to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, a group of NGOs took the government to court, and the Pretoria High Court ruled against the government, and the government accepted the ruling. I think that was a very good indication of the fact that the democracy there is working. Now, when you look at Ghana, for example, Ghana has problems, but Ghana is going in the right direction also. Even though they're having problems now with the election, what we've seen in the past is that the former president of Ghana lost an election. He was an incumbent, and he lost an election. And he immediately conceded to the winner, the opposition, and left the government. And in his concession speech, he argued that to his people, to his supporters, that look, the emphasis is not on me and my supporters. The emphasis should be on maintaining the Ghanaian system, the Ghanaian democratic system. So I'm going to go ahead and leave. We've lost. Let's go home, and then we can come back and fight another day. So there are countries in Africa that are doing very well, not as well as we hope they would, but they are doing very well. The problem that we have with what is happening in the US is that many African countries in the 1990s were looking to the US as a platform for them to democratize their systems. And so what has been happening in the US in the last couple of months has really been very, very, very disheartening for many Africans, because when I talk to people in Africa, they tell me if the US is unable to have a peaceful transition, how would they expect us that have had very little experience with democracy, the US, which has had more than 200 years of experience with democracy, a solid constitution, how are we supposed to, those of us who have only been able to start looking at democracy seriously since the 1990s, how are we expected to behave? What I tell them is that despite what is happening in the US, the system is resilient enough that it will eventually recover. And that what the system that was established back in 1789 with the Constitution is resilient enough, so much so that don't look at the individuals who are misbehaving. Look at the system. That is what you should be interested in. That is what you should try to emulate. That is the system that we have in the US. You have a good judiciary, judiciary system. You have a good legislative system. You have a strong presidential system. So the individuals who are there, if you think those individuals are trying to mess up the system or destroy the system, in the long run, they are not going to succeed. They may do so in the short run, but in the long run, I tell them that in the long run, the US system will survive because of the nature of the institutions, and perhaps most importantly, because you have a very robust and politically active civil society. And so for me, when I talk to Africans, I tell them what we need to do is establish a strong civil society organizations like the Free Press and so on and so on. If we have those systems, just like the US, we will survive.
Thank you. We've got just a minute or two left. I want to ask Sarah and Francis if they each have a closing thought or comment they want to share with our audience before we wrap up. Sarah?
I guess what I would say is that, that this year, which has been hard for all of us, has really shown the resilience of democracy in so many cases, and the creativity of civil society, as John was referring to, in figuring out ways to protest, to organize, to get their views across, to organize elections in face of challenge. And I think that, as John said, it's not about the individual people. There's a long game here, and I think that we can all be optimistic that democracy continues to be the most appealing form of government for the most people on Earth, and that it will find a way.
I second that, and I would just add, I think there is a silver lining of the fact that the US's own democratic deficiencies have been pretty clear this year. And that is that it's bringing to light there's many examples of successful democracies that are not the 800-pound gorilla that the United States is. So John mentioned a couple examples in Africa. I would also add Canada, New Zealand, Australia, several of the Nordic countries. There's a lot of different models. And I think if we can get away from this idea that the US is the democracy exporter and teaches other countries how to do democracy, and instead think about mutual learning among governments, among civil societies, among legislatures, I think that's more productive anyhow. And I'm excited to potentially see the democracy agenda go in that direction, sort of towards mutual learning. And I think that's a really exciting prospect. And then I think the interest in democracy shown by citizens like members of the World Affairs Council here, I think that's also tremendously heartening. So I hope this is the first of many conversations on this going forward.
As our board chair likes to say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's, I think, what you're talking about democracy over the long haul, and part of why we're so happy to be here at the World Affairs Council, engaging our members, engaging discussions like this with you all, so we can go together and get farther. Thank you again to our members and our listeners and our panelists tonight, as well as our sponsors, KeyBank and the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joe's University. You all make this programming possible and interesting and accessible to people all over the country. Best wishes to you all for a safe and sane and civil holiday season. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.